Hello everyone. If you are new to my channel, then consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do it, thanks. By the way, I also have a Luffy fan fiction channel. If you are interested, the link is in the description.
Team 8 by Starcan. What if Naruto had been selected for a different team? What if he'd had a different mentor? Who would guess the consequences would be so large? Adios.
Chapter 17 Haruno Sakura felt her mouth drop open as she watched the medic nins run out into the arena and carefully place the body of Hyuga Neji onto a stretcher. She barely saw them carry the genin away. Instead, her eyes were fixed on the blood spattered on the ground. Damn, that was cold, Kiba murmured next to her, jolting her out of her shocked reverie. Sasuke grunted. Sakura turned towards her crush, but his eyes were intently fixed on Uzumaki Naruto. Their former classmate appeared to be getting chewed out by Gekko Hayate, the Jonin referee. Sakura turned to her sensei, who was sitting in the row behind them. He'd allowed them a break from training in order to watch the finals, for which she was very grateful. I never thought Naruto could be so brutal, she said after a moment, hoping Kakashi could explain what they'd just seen. He'd been better about doing that lately. The last month had been very different from their earlier training. During the first team meeting since their elimination in the preliminaries, Kakashi-sensei had said he'd been very disappointed by their poor showing. Sasuke, who'd been silent since the medic nins fixed his jaw, simply exploded, demanding that Kakashi train them. Kakashi-sensei had claimed that he was allowing them to develop their own skills, but if they couldn't be that responsible, what followed had been the most grueling workout Team 7 had ever undertaken. Since then, every team exercise had been like that. Kakashi-sensei had even started showing up for meetings on time, mostly, and his little orange books had been conspicuously absent. Sakura jumped when Kiba made a disparaging noise. I thought you were the brains of this team, Haruno, he said in a challenging tone. You saw what that jerk did to Hinata. Sakura turned back toward her teammate, since Kakashi-sensei hadn't even acknowledged her question. You think he's still that angry about it? She asked. What she'd seen was, so far beyond what she expected from Naruto, it just didn't make sense to her. She's his partner, Kiba replied with a shrug. Sakura felt her eyes bug out at her teammate's insinuation. Hinata is a nice girl, she snapped, slapping the back of Kiba's head. He'd let slip once that his sister did that to him, and it really irritated him. It was Sakura's best weapon for keeping the crude Inuzuka in line. Not like that, Kiba protested, blocking her second swat. Who has the dirty mind now? He asked with a smirk. Look, she's his teammate, and they train together almost constantly. Akamaru and I run across their sense all the time, especially near the training grounds. How often do you see one without the other during the day? At least before her idiot cousin put her in the hospital. Sakura frowned. Why didn't you say so then? She asked. I meant partner, like Akamaru. Kiba shot back. If someone deliberately hurt him, I'd kill them. The puppy wrapped around his neck, yipped and licked Kiba's cheek, making him blink. That's why Sasuke's strategy was flawed, Kakashi-sensei said in a contemplative tone. Taunting him did provoke a reaction, but since he couldn't attack Neji, you took his place. Maybe you got off lightly. With that, Kakashi-sensei reached forward and mussed Sasuke's hair, which Sakura knew irritated him to no end. But was that the only reason Sasuke-kun's scowl deepened? Naruto scowled up at Hayate. Do you understand? The Jonin asked again. One more late hit and I'll throw you out of here myself. It wasn't a late hit, Naruto said, swallowing his anger. You didn't say anything until after I hit him. You already had him beat, Hayate said in a lower voice. That was unnecessary. Naruto narrowed his eyes. Just like before, right? Hayate turned and coughed. You aren't making yourself any friends here, Uzumaki, he said, though his voice wasn't as angry. Naruto could hear some angry shouts mixed in with the scattered cheers. If people hated him for beating the Hyuga prodigy, he wasn't sure he cared what they thought. People already hate me for stupid reasons. Nothing I do here today will change that, he replied, shrugging. Hayate sighed before raising his voice. Winner, Uzumaki Naruto. As the majority of the stadium erupted in applause. Amino Iruka turned toward his neighbors in the quietest section of the stands. Well, he said in a cultured voice, I suppose that does make it official, doesn't it? It doesn't matter, one of the older Hyugas snapped. He must have cheated to defeat Neji. That brat could never do that on his own. Therefore, any wagers are void. I say, Iruka protested in a mild tone. Will you be asking the Hokage to intervene? Surely he will see justice done. He glanced around to see if anyone reacted to that. Unfortunately, Hyuga Hiyashi had left the moment his nephew had been knocked out. Inwardly, he was pleased that they seemed to have forgotten his earlier slip. I have every confidence he will see things our way once this is all over, a fat man in a richly brocaded robe announced. Very well, Iruka conceded, if that is the case, I will be sure to return your wagers immediately. Return? The fat man asked. Well yes, Iruka said with a smile. Our wagers are, after all, contingent on the official outcome of the match. At the current time, that outcome is a victory for this Uzumaki ruffian. While I wouldn't dream of doubting your word that justice will prevail for your young Neji, it would be a shocking scandal if those around us thought you were actually reneging on your wagers. No sooner had the words left Iruka's lips than several of his companions began glancing around. A few of the workmen and minor merchants near them did seem rather curious as to their lack of reaction to the conclusion of a spectacular match. That was more than enough to fertilize the seed of paranoia he'd planted. In short order, Iruka was folding a collection of banknotes, money orders, and what looked like the deed to some sort of shop. "Well, I am simply famished," he announced. "I think I will make my way to one of the food sellers before the next match begins. If this decision is reversed, you may of course contact me through the Hokage's visitor registry. I am staying with a distant cousin, one Amino Iruka." With that, he made his way through the crowds as the next match was announced. He was a little worried that Naruto might have gone too far with Hyuga Neji, but he accepted that if he had, it was with reason. He'd just shown people the folly of doubting Naruto. He wasn't about to start doing it himself. He just hoped Naruto would accept a really big bowl of ramen in lieu of some cheering. Despite everything that had happened, Naruto was still surprised by the reaction of the spectators as he turned to retrieve his weights. He wasn't completely happy with how the match had gone, but he had won, after all. He just wasn't used to people clapping their hands and cheering. He couldn't remember the last time someone outside his circle of precious people had recognized his efforts. But it felt really good. Recognizing that warm glow, he finally did remember. Shino's parents. Mastering his emotions was hard, but he swallowed and reacted the way Hinata had shown him that night. He turned toward the Hokage's box and bowed deeply. Then he turned toward the center of the audience seating and repeated the gesture. The cheers grew even louder and Naruto found his hands were shaking a little as he pulled his chakra-enhanced weights from where they'd embedded themselves in the ground. Kuranai felt her smile growing wider. She glanced over at Hinata, who appeared rooted in place. Naruto's gracious acknowledgement of the praise could only have one ultimate source, but she didn't think her subordinate recognized that. The girl seemed somewhat disturbed by the brutal conclusion of the match, but she needed to recognize the necessity of what had just happened. She also needed to understand that she did have value, and that what happened to her at the preliminary sequences. Kuranai shook her head, even as her hands continued adding to the applause. That was a concern for another day. She wasn't as concerned about Shino's match, but something could still go wrong. Naruto was still adjusting his wrist weights when he made his way back to the examinee's balcony. "Did you fulfill all your stated objectives?" Shino asked, turning toward him. Naruto nodded. "Pretty much. It was difficult to ascertain at long distance," Shino observed, "but the damage appeared extensive." Naruto shrugged. "I did what I set out to do." Shikamaru glanced back and forth between the two of them. "You're not up to something troublesome, are you?" he finally asked in a disgusted voice. "We are establishing a precedent regarding acceptable behavior towards allies and team members," Shino announced. "To that end, we propose to demonstrate a willingness to use any and all means to obtain an equitable response, ranging from coercion, influence, and tactical intelligence, to, as needed, extreme levels of physical violence." Shikamaru rolled his eyes and sighed. "How would you feel if someone hurt Ino and put her in the hospital for 3 weeks? Naruto demanded, frowning. "Relieved," Shikamaru said, but then let out a grunt when Choji elbowed him. "Okay, that would be troublesome too. But he's her cousin. Do you think the Hyugas are going to like you messing around in their clan's politics?" Naruto's eyes narrowed as he regarded the lazy Nara. Despite his demeanor, his classmate was smarter than he normally acted. He probably didn't want his teachers to expect more out of him. "That is precisely the point," Shino replied. "If we are willing to do that to her cousin, a member of a powerful and highly respected clan with a superior bloodline, then what will we do to someone else? Better if your teammate wasn't so weak she needed you two to protect her." The blonde girl from Suna spat in a disgusted tone. Her expression suggested that she tasted something foul. "She's not weak," Naruto snapped, clenching his fists. Even an echo of Neji's words still had the power to enrage him. "She's been told that all her life and it's nothing but bullshit." He made himself relax when Shino put a hand on his shoulder. The gesture from his normally reserved teammate was like a bucket of cold water on his anger. "It's not weakness that kept Hyuga Hinata on her feet with a collapsed lung and lacerations of the left ventricle," Shino stated. "It's not weakness that made her keep getting up to fight an opponent that knew every move of her fighting style and whom she had no real expectation of defeating. I believe the appropriate descriptor is determination." Naruto was vaguely aware that Shikamaru and Choji were openly staring at Shino. Maybe they didn't know how badly Hinata had been injured, or maybe it was the undertone of anger in the usually emotionless Abarame's voice. In any event, the coldly analytical burst of killing intent made the Suna girl take a step back even as the face-painted guy stepped forward. "If you disrupt the matches, I will kill you all," Gaara said, speaking up for the first time. While the red-headed boy was staring at Naruto when he spoke, the fear on their faces suggested that Gaara's words were directed more towards his teammates. In any event, the two of them pointedly turned their backs on the Konoha genin and joined their brother at the railing. Naruto swallowed. According to the dossiers Kuranai had prepared, all three of the Suna genin were children of the case cage. They sure didn't act like siblings as far as he could tell. Not for the first time, he wondered how accurate Hinata's guesses about Gaara's upbringing were. Would he act like that if no one had ever accepted him? He shuddered. Then his attention was drawn toward the arena. The next match, Hayate announced, his voice as loud as the wheezy Chunin could probably manage, will be Aburame Shino vs Akamichi Choji. Naruto turned and gave Shino a quick nod of encouragement. Shino nodded back and turned toward the stairs. Naruto stepped out of Choji's way as the heavy-set boy followed Shino. Then he slowly walked up to join Shikamaru at the railing. To be honest, Naruto wasn't as worried about this match as he might have been. While the Akamichi boy had hurt his preliminary match opponent worse than anyone else, it hadn't really been intentional. The older genin he'd crushed was still recovering and, from what Naruto had heard, Asuma had to talk Choji out of dropping out of the exam in remorse. To Naruto, it seemed like he'd sort of been asking for it, taunting Choji like that. But Shino wasn't that stupid, and he never underestimated his opponent. But even if Choji did surprise him, Naruto knew he wouldn't intentionally try to inflict lasting harm. The same couldn't be said of everyone that still remained, and he found himself watching Gaara again with his peripheral vision. As the boys walked out onto the grounds, Naruto noticed Choji was strapping some metallic bracers to his forearms. He knew from Kuranai sensei's notes that some Akamichi, including Choji's father, augmented their impressive physiques with heavier armor than most shinobi. Choji hadn't started to do so before the exam, but watching Shino's match with Kiba evidently persuaded him to start. Hayate appeared to speak quietly to both examinees for a moment. Naruto imagined it was more of the same, "Stop when I tell you to stop," stuff. Too bad he hadn't been so cautious in the preliminary matches. Finally, Hayate signaled for them to start. To Naruto's surprise, Shino didn't immediately draw his kamas. Instead, he leapt back, putting some distance between himself and the Akamichi. Choji didn't waste any time, immediately using his meatball tank technique. It seemed to Naruto that he'd been practicing it, because his body morphed into a perfect sphere even faster than it did at the preliminary matches. Naruto frowned. It was also rolling noticeably faster than he remembered. Thus began an extended game of tag, with Choji chasing Shino around the arena. Shino threw a couple of kunai, but they merely bounced off the rolling juggernaut that their classmate had transformed into. Naruto frowned. He didn't think Shino's bugs could hold onto Choji in this form either. If weapons bounced off as well, what could Shino do? Naruto's grip on the railing tightened as it looked like Shino was getting maneuvered into a corner. Choji turned a little tighter than Naruto thought he could, blocking Shino against a couple of small trees. Just as his teammate crouched to leap over them, Choji put on an unexpected burst of speed and sideswiped him. Naruto inhaled sharply. There was a burst of splinters as Choji ground the substitution log that took Shino's place into splinters before slamming into the arena wall. The impact made the whole stadium rumble and sent up a huge cloud of dust. When the dust settled, Choji was sprawled atop the small pile of rubble his technique had gouged out of the arena wall. Shino was calmly standing a short distance away, his hands in his jacket pockets. The crowd had fallen silent, and with effort Naruto could just barely make out their words. "That is a very impressive technique," Shino observed. "Not impressive enough," Choji groaned, rolling onto his knees to face his opponent. "You were, however, able to sustain it much longer before running out of chakra," Shino said. "That's true," Choji agreed. But then he abruptly jerked to his feet and stepped forward. "But I'm not out of chakra. Baika no jutsu," he shouted, raising his right arm which ballooned out to a monstrous size. "Sorry Shino," he said quickly as he smashed it down on the transfixed Aburame. Naruto felt his heart skip a beat as the giant fist obliterated his friend, making a large crater in the ground. Shikamaru grunted, sounding annoyed. Then Naruto saw the cloud of Kikai bugs settling on Choji's arm, swarming up it even as it shrank back to normal size. Choji swatted at them, but there were too many. A few flying bugs EVR. His motions became slower and slower as they drained his chakra, until he finally fell to his knees. Shino stepped out from behind one of the trees. Breathing heavily, Choji managed to gasp out, "You got me, call them off." Shino didn't move, but the Kikai bugs left Choji's body as quickly as they'd boarded. Soon they were streaming back under his jacket to return to their nesting places, something which Naruto spent a lot of effort trying to not think about. The crowd had fallen silent at the unexpected conclusion to the match, but the applause started up when Shino helped Choji to his feet and Hayate belatedly declared him the victor. The cheers continued as the boys made their way off the field. When they returned to the examinee's balcony, Naruto was amused to note that while Choji was eating rapidly, to restore his chakra reserves, Shino also held an unopened bag of chips in his hand. Up in the stands, Aburame Misato leaned against her husband's shoulder. "He's such a good boy," she cooed. Shibi adjusted his glasses and then nodded. The resolution of this match without unnecessary rancor speaks well regarding his maturity and emotional restraint. It is, however, probably for the best that he was not required to meet the Hyuga we witnessed in the first match. Misato shrugged. It might be better for that thug, but I think it wouldn't hurt Shino at all. You Aburame men are so quiet. It's pretty striking when you get passionate about something. It's about time Shino had a few girls after him. Shibi turned to stare at his wife, eyebrows clearly visible above his glasses. What? She asked with an innocent expression. It worked on me, didn't it? Shibi chose not to answer that question. The other Aburames sitting near them didn't react either. Many of them had heard of Shino's speech before the clan council and decided to attend the finals to see how he performed under a different variety of pressure. But everyone in the clan was familiar with Misato's eccentricities. Kuranai let out a quiet sigh of relief when Shino won. Choji had performed slightly better than expected, but Shino had allowed for that as well. That was kind of boring, she heard someone say behind her. Yeah, someone else agreed. Not like that first one. That Uzumaki kid really kicked his ass. Yeah, he was definitely out for blood, an older man's voice agreed darkly. A real killer, that one. Kuranai felt her lips compress and glanced over at Hinata. The girl had been visibly upset before, but now she was shocked to see Hinata standing up and turning to face the men behind her. Naruto-kun is no more a killer than any other shinobi, she said, her voice brimming with outrage. Shino-kun and Choji-san are classmates, and didn't really want to hurt each other. Neji was not like that, so Naruto couldn't be either. As soon as she finished, Hinata appeared to become aware of everyone around them staring at her. She blushed and abruptly sat down. Kuranai gave her genin an approving smile, even as she circulated chakra in her ears to pick up the whispers of those around them. Who is that? I think she's a Hyuga, like that Neji guy. Yeah, and I think she's teammates with the Uzumaki brat and the bug creep. I wouldn't call him a brat. My cousin says his team saved the Hokage's grandson when he was kidnapped. No kidding? Whether she heard them or not, Hinata's expression didn't change. It was set in determined lines Kuranai hadn't seen for weeks. Yuahi Kuranai smiled as a knot of tension began to loosen in her stomach. The next match pitted Shikamaru against the Sankunoichi, Temari, and it started off as one of the most boring fights Naruto had ever seen. The lazy genius didn't seem too pleased to be fighting a girl, but Naruto thought he'd be even less happy about getting his butt kicked by one. As it was, he took his own sweet time ambling down the stairs to the arena floor. This unwillingness must have been apparent to Temari, because she began to look really annoyed. Hayate spoke to them briefly, but Naruto guessed that Shikamaru also must have said something because Temari suddenly looked murderous. The Sankunoichi swung her fan at Shikamaru, making Hayate dive backwards to avoid being struck by the follow-through. The chakra-enhanced blast of wind threw up an enormous cloud of dust, but when it settled, there was no sign of her opponent. A couple of minutes later, Naruto finally spotted his classmate. Shikamaru was skulking around the small glade of trees planted in the floor of the arena. Unlike the preliminary matches, the finals were held in an arena with more variable terrain. This made certain tactics possible, like the ones Shikamaru seemed to be intent on using. Temari ground her teeth and stomped, but Naruto knew she wasn't stupid enough to run into the trees. Shikamaru's cage main technique would grab her before she could do anything. Instead, she paced the area a good distance away from the grove, using her fan whenever she saw Shikamaru step out from behind a tree. Fortunately for the lazy genius, Temari's wind attacks also threw up great clouds of dust from the dry ground, making it difficult for anyone to see where he went when he evaded her blasts. In short, the trees were taking an awful beating, with branches snapped off and strips of bark ripped from their trunks, but Shikamaru managed to avoid serious injury. Temari began to press her attack, moving in closer. However, after one of her blasts, Naruto grinned to see a shadowy tendril emerge from the dust cloud, sliding along the ground toward Temari's feet. Unfortunately, the Kunoichi saw it as well and leapt backwards just as Shikamaru's jutsu hit the limits of its reach. Temari contemptuously drew a line in the sand with her fan and thereafter refused to get closer, even for a moment. The barrage of wind attacks resumed with no further response from Shikamaru. If it wasn't for the occasional glimpse he saw, Naruto might have wondered if a stray hit had disabled him. After almost half an hour of this, Naruto saw something fly up out of the treetops. It spun as it unfolded, revealing itself to be Shikamaru's jacket, turned into a parachute weighted down with a kunai. Shikamaru's shadow shot out again, much faster and thicker this time. It became thinner as it slowed down, but it reached much further than before. Naruto glanced up at the sun, and realized it was significantly lower in the sky now, extending the shadows of both Shikamaru and the arena walls. Unfortunately, Temari glanced up as well, and saw the improvised parachute just as Shikamaru's tendril touched the parachute's shadow. Boosting itself off of the parachute, it arced toward Temari's feet, but she was already in motion. Leaping backward, Temari swung her fan, getting her whole body into the motion. The parachute was flung away by the stiff wind, foiling Shikamaru's attack even as the backdraft kicked up another cloud of dust. But when the dust cleared, it revealed Temari standing in an unnatural posture. It took only a moment for Naruto to realize that she was aping Shikamaru's stoop-shouldered crouch. As the dust settled, he saw Shikamaru's shadow extending forward from his feet, angling off toward the holes Naruto's weights had left in the ground. The sun was at a sufficiently sharp angle to leave the bottom of them in shadow, and it looked like Shikamaru had used those shadows to boost his own shadow far enough to capture Temari. The kunoichi's face was a mask of chagrin as she straightened up and marched toward Shikamaru, just as he walked toward her. The only difference between them was that she actually held a fan in her hands, while Shikamaru's hands grasped only empty air. When they were about 10 feet apart, Shikamaru peered intently at her, cocking his head to the side. It was odd seeing Temari do the same. The grimace on her face spoke volumes. "I could make you beat yourself unconscious with your fan," Shikamaru said with a sigh, "but that would be far too troublesome. I give up." Shikamaru romped Temari, turned, and ambled back toward the stairs. Naruto thought he could hear a cricket chirping somewhere. Temari didn't even look at Hayate as he reluctantly declared her the winner. Her face a mask of embarrassed fury, she jumped on her fan and rode it directly up to the balcony. Naruto glanced over at the sand genin. Gaara's face was an emotionless mask, but Kankuro was barely suppressing a smirk. But as Temari landed, the massive killing intent she radiated seemed to make him change his mind about saying something. Choji sidestepped until Shino was between him and the sand team. Naruto frowned for a moment, and then headed down the stairs at a quick trot. He didn't understand what was going on down there, but he didn't think Temari was in any mood to talk. As he suspected, Shikamaru was less than a quarter of the way up the stairs when he met him, ambling along like he was in no particular hurry. Shikamaru frowned when he saw Naruto. "Are they making you fight again? I didn't think your next match was for a while yet?" "Why did you give up?" Naruto asked bluntly, taking care not to raise his voice. Shikamaru sighed. "It's too troublesome, that's all." Naruto shook his head. "No more troublesome than having to take the whole genin exam over again because you crapped out at the last moment." Shikamaru's eyes narrowed. "When did you start thinking about something besides pranks and ramen?" he asked. "Sensei expects more from me," Naruto answered, "and you still haven't answered my question." Shikamaru sighed and slowly resumed his trudge up the stairs. She was holding back. "Temari?" Naruto asked. "No, Amaterasu the Heavenly Empress," Shikamaru replied. "Who else would I be talking about besides Temari?" "Sorry, geez," Naruto apologized, shrugging. "Anyway," Shikamaru continued, "she wasn't attacking all out today, even when I came close to catching her earlier. She's conserving her strength for some reason, so I decided it might not be a good idea to squander all of mine." "Maybe she was saving her chakra for her next match?" Naruto asked. He tried to remember who she'd be fighting next. "I'm not quite that pathetic, Naruto," Shikamaru replied with a disgusted look, "and I did catch her in the end. I don't know if there is something going on, but if there is I will be ready." Naruto frowned. "All right, you tell Choji and I'll let Shino know." Up in the stands, Sarutobi Asuma scowled. It was official now, both of Kurenai's students have advanced farther than his. He took a drag on his cigarette. Knowing it would be the last one he would enjoy for the next couple of months. If Shikamaru had beaten both of her students in the finals, he could have claimed a victory, no matter that Choji was defeated. He sighed. Getting Kurenai to pose for that swimsuit calendar would have been a major coup. He would even have allowed her to choose a tasteful, conservative suit. The fact that he'd gotten her to do it would have made him the envy of Konohagakure, at least the male half. He shook his head, annoyed at his lazy genius of a student. It didn't make sense. He'd told Shikamaru that if he forfeited he'd be paired with Ino for every group exercise until the end of the year. Usually, Asuma partnered up with the bossy blonde himself to give the boys a break, something he knew Shikamaru appreciated. So why would? Asuma's frown deepened. He sat up in his seat and tugged on the sides of his vest to straighten it. This also gave his fingers the chance to loosen his trench knives in their scabbards. He glanced across several rows to where Kakashi was sitting and caught the Jonin's eye. Something might be up. He glanced over to where Ino was sitting with her parents. She would be all right there. Too bad Guy hadn't returned to his seat yet. For obvious reasons, the arena had a small but well-equipped infirmary. The nature of shinobi combat was such that immediately life-threatening wounds were always a possibility, so sending the injured across town to the hospital wasn't an option. Two men, one garbed in flowing white, the other in stretchy green, confronted each other in the hallway outside the medical bay. It was fortunate that the room was chakra shielded to aid in performing delicate medical jutsu. For if the seals carved into the walls had not been there, the massive killing intent in the hall might have distracted the medics from their urgent work. "They are still seeing to him," Maida Guy said in a quiet voice. "He's lost a lot of blood." Hyuga Hiyashi's eyes narrowed marginally. "I'm sure you feel quite vindicated after he spurned your assistance this past month." The words were spoken in a calm tone. but the undercurrent of venom was unmistakable. Guy shook his head. No, it was his choice to make, as it will be his choice whether he learns the youthful lesson or not. Lesson? Hiyashi inquired in a polite, but cold voice. A minute vertical crease had appeared between his eyebrows. Neji has finally encountered a foe that all of his anger and his bitterness could not defeat, Guy declared. If he takes the correct path and casts aside his past, he will finally be able to stoke the fires of his youth. With every word from Guy, the crease deepened until it began to resemble a drawn-together scar. Enough? Hiyashi finally snapped. No more of your drivel. Neji failed today, and has drawn shame to the Hyuga name. He will make amends for this. And if he extracts any of your youthful lessons from this utter failure, I'll activate his seal myself. Hiyashi spun toward a nurse who'd stepped out of the clinic to see what all the shouting was about. She froze in place, terrified at being subjected to such massive killing intent. I am to be informed the moment Hyuga Neji regains consciousness, is that clear? It took a moment for the hapless woman to find her voice again. Why yes, Hiyashi-sama, she finally stammered. Hiyashi spun on his heel and stalked off. Guy quietly cleared his throat, jerking the woman out of her relieved reverie. How is Neji doing? He asked in a quiet voice. By the time Naruto and Shikamaru made it back up the stairs, Shino and Choji were openly staring at the sand team. Hey, do I look stupid or something? Kankuro demanded belligerently. What's wrong? Naruto asked. Shino turned towards him, but Naruto had a feeling his attention was still focused on the Suna shinobi. Kankuro forfeited as soon as his match with Gaara was announced, he said. Surprised, Naruto turned toward the face-painted ninja. But the boy just shrugged. I know there's no way I can beat Gaara, so it's stupid to even try. Remembering Shikamaru's observations, Naruto began to feel even more uneasy. Yeah, but between this and getting a bye in the preliminaries, aren't you pretty much guaranteed not to be made a chunin? He asked with what he hoped looked like honest confusion. Kankuro's hesitation was slight, but unmistakable. I'm not in any real hurry to advance, he replied in a casual tone. Naruto shook his head in puzzlement. Whatever, he said and went to go stand by his teammate. Suna is up to something, Naruto murmured under his breath as soon as Shino's mask blocked any view they might have had of his lips. I concur, Shino replied. After a quick consultation with the two Kage, Hayate returned to the arena floor. The next match will be Uzumaki Naruto and Sabaku no Gaara. Only iron control kept Kurenai's face from betraying any emotion. Despite her unease with this turn of events, she was forced to admit the Hokage probably had his reasons. Gaara had yet to face anyone, and Naruto had the most time to recover from his previous match. Moreover, given his stamina, she had little doubt that her genin was as ready as he would ever be. And if Gaara's aggressive behavior got out of control, he was probably the best equipped to survive it. But that didn't mean she had to like it. Glancing over at her subordinate, it wasn't hard to see the concern on Hinata's face. Given her confidence in Naruto's capabilities, it might have a place. But it was also true that Hinata had encountered Sabaku no Gaara at a time when the bland demeanor shielding his bloodlust was wholly absent. Kurenai felt her unease grow stronger by the second. Uruka fought off a wave of worried nausea as he sat down in the seat Ichiraku Tuchi and his daughter Ayame had saved for him. His rich kimono drew a few odd looks from their neighbors, but he ignored them. A quick nod confirmed that the plan had worked, making Tuchi break out into a wide smile that Iruka did not share. He should have expected Naruto would eventually face Gaara, but he'd hoped it would have been later. Perhaps after the disturbing boy had done something to get himself disqualified. He shook his head. Not that it was likely, given his parentage. But the few hints he'd picked up from Kurenai implied that he wasn't the only one concerned. Who's this red-headed kid he's fighting now? Ayame asked, peering over at Iruka with clear concern. Dangerous, Iruka said. The third Hokage of Konohagakure straightened slightly in his seat, trying to find a posture that would ease the aching in his tired old bones. He glanced over at his fellow Kage, wondering what was going through the man's mind. When Hayate appeared before them to consult on the second round of matches, the Kage had seemed unusually interested in seeing Naruto pitted against his son. Perhaps he felt that only another jinchuriki could provide an adequate test for his prodigy. Perhaps he wished to make some subtle point regarding the relative strengths of the two allied villages. Perhaps it was a waste of time to try and understand a man who could order an already bound demon be sealed within his youngest son. This should be a very illuminating contest, the Kage murmured. Sarutobi nodded, not trusting his voice. Naruto grinned. He was going to make a point of being extra nice to Oji-san next time he talked to him. He'd much rather fight Gaara than Shino, and volunteering him to fight the Suna Jinchuriki was a vote of confidence in his abilities that he wouldn't forget anytime soon. Not to mention him being the Kage's son. While Gaara made his way toward the stairs, Naruto vaulted over the railing, landing near the entry arch in a deep crouch. Dusting himself off, he ignored the murmurs of the crowd as he made his way over to Hayate before Gaara even appeared. He didn't think the weird kid would try anything on the stairs, but better not to take any chances. "You ready for this?" Hayate murmured without moving his lips. Naruto gave a short nod. The murmuring of the audience was quite audible. He didn't know if they were talking about his last match or wondering if he was about to get creamed. It didn't really matter though. For once, they weren't ignoring him. For once, everyone was looking at Uzumaki Naruto. It was an odd feeling, especially for a ninja. Was this how the old man felt every day? Was this part of being Hokage? The crowds became louder as Gaara emerged from the archway. Naruto bounced lightly on the balls of his feet, trying to loosen up until Hayate gave him a sharp look. In sharp contrast, Gaara stood there as if ignoring everything in the world. Except Naruto. His dark ringed eyes bored into Naruto's. "Will you validate my existence?" he asked in a dry whisper. "Begin," Hayate announced, but he was already in midair, leaping back and away from the two combatants. Naruto didn't waste any time. He charged in, attacking as hard and as fast as he could manage. Sand flowed out of the calabash gourd on Gaara's back. It surged around him, blocking every attack, and then reached out to grab Naruto. Naruto darted in and out, trying to get a feel for how fast the sand could move. After a couple of near misses, he leapt backward. Gaara hadn't even moved from the spot he started the fight in. "Let's see how fast you are with wet sand," Naruto taunted. "Sweeten. Condensation," he cried as he finished the seals, pumping as much chakra into the technique as he could manage without totally disrupting it. A geyser of water roared out of the vortex that formed in front of Naruto's clasped hands. It shot toward Gaara, only to be blocked by the sand. Huge clots of wet sand flew in a spray around the Sunagenin, but as he frowned, the sand shielding him compressed more and more until the water just sprayed off it to little effect. Landing in a crouch, Naruto grinned. The spatters of wet sand were returning to Gaara, but nowhere near as quickly as they normally moved. "Kage Bunshin no Jutsu," he called out, surrounding his enemy with clones. The clones scattered, throwing kunai and loose stones, dodging back as tendrils of sand lashed out at them. Naruto circled around, dodging like crazy, even using Kawarimi no Jutsu to switch places with his clones to avoid pounding hammers of sand. Every time he got a clear shot, he blasted Gaara with another overloaded sweetened fire hose. It was getting harder and harder to do as he leached most of the free moisture from the air and ground of the arena. But it forced Gaara to tie up more and more of his sand into forming a sandstone shell around him to stop the blasts. Finally, Gaara had completely surrounded himself with a sphere of compressed sand that seemed impervious to Naruto's attacks. Kunai glanced off, and any of his clones that wandered too close were impaled on spikes that grew out of the surface. That's when Naruto dropped to the ground a good 10 meters from his foe and used his trump card against ultimate defenses. "Doden. Yomi Numa," he said as he stamped the ground. Funneling the chakra through his leg was good practice. And it looked really cool as well. As before, the ground dropped away in front of him, being converted into swampy mire as all the standing water from his sweeping attacks was pulled into the swamp of the underworld technique. Gaara's sphere immediately began to descend into the muck. Sandstone, natural or not, was heavy. As Naruto watched it drop into the mud, a much smaller sphere that looked eerily like an eye appeared on top of Gaara's refuge. It quickly looked left and right in a way that suggested startled panic. Naruto's grin widened. It looked like his guess had paid off. Ultimate defense or not, Gaara still needed to breathe. The stone sphere split apart like an orange peel, wedge-shaped sections peeling back and elongating as they reached toward the edges of Naruto's swamp. Gaara was revealed, standing on the lower half of the stony sphere as it raised itself above the mire. Naruto flashed forward, his weights left on the ground behind him. Charging into Sabaku no Gaara's defenses at anything less than full speed was suicide, so he pushed himself to go as fast as possible. Lee had managed to avoid the sand for a while, even before opening his celestial gates, so Naruto thought the risk was worth it. He cleared half the width of his swamp in a single running leap. Evidently the sand moved slower when compressed, because it didn't immediately grab his foot when he landed and punched Gaara full on in the face. The startled sand shinobi didn't even try to block and Naruto wondered if he knew any taijutsu. Still, Naruto's fist felt like he'd punched a tree as Gaara catapulted backward off of the platform. It must have been that stupid final layer of sand that had protected Gaara from Lee's attacks. Naruto leapt clear just as the sand reached for his feet. He'd angled the blow upwards to knock Gaara completely clear of the swamp, and the follow-up kick he'd landed in midair slammed Gaara to the ground well clear of the jutsu. Wisps of sand were already detaching themselves from the remains of Gaara's calabash and reaching towards Naruto. When he landed he pivoted and ran past Gaara, hammer-fisting the back of his opponent's head as he went. Gaara was catapulted off of his feet, landing even farther from the swamp. Naruto wasn't sure if Gaara's control over his sand grew weaker with distance or not, but getting him farther away from the mass slowly pushing itself out of the swamp seemed like remaining sand cushioned his landing, so Naruto gave him another fire hose blast from Sweden. Condensation. This far away from his previous uses of the technique. It worked much better than the last few times he'd tried it, and Gaara was sent tumbling. So far, his plan was working perfectly. Kuranai couldn't help but raise her eyebrows at her student's aggressive tactics. Evidently, he was trying to deny Gaara any opportunity to collect himself and was wearing down his defenses by tying up his sand in various ways. So far, it seemed to be working, but she wondered if Naruto had placed too great a reliance on the information she gathered. "Ooh, wow, Naruto's really cleaning his cloth," Tucci said in a low voice. Ayame was biting her knuckle in an attempt to stifle her squeals. Iruka nodded slowly, amazed by how much his one-time problem student had progressed. At the same time, he worried about what he'd overheard earlier. Naruto's enemies would never again assume he was no threat. He just hoped the boy was ready. Naruto's knuckles were throbbing, but Gaara's armor of sand looked more like a jigsaw puzzle. He landed an uppercut under Gaara's jaw that sent a jolt of pain down the length of his forearm. Gaara, however, was lifted off his feet and landed in a heap. Mindful of Hayate's wrath and the fact that this was the Kage's son, Naruto paused for a second before kicking him again. "Do you want to stop this, Gaara-san?" he asked. Gaara ignored the question. Instead, he reached with trembling fingers toward his mouth, which was now bleeding freely from a split lip. Blotting the crimson with his fingertips, he pulled his hand back and stared at it, and then screamed. A burst of golden-colored chakra sent Naruto stumbling backwards. Gaara's bloody hand morphed into a monstrous tan appendage far too big for the body it was attached to. It lashed out with shocking speed and sent Naruto flying backwards. Gaara staggered to his feet, his arms slowly returning to normal. Naruto barely saw the shadow forming around him in time to leap clear before a tidal wave of sand engulfed him. He landed awkwardly, still dazed from the blow, and rolled to his feet in time to see Gaara's sand return to him. Up in the stands, people began falling asleep as visions of falling feathers dulled their wits. Kuranai felt the illusionary technique as soon as it began. It wasn't especially hard to resist, but what was surprising was how widespread it seemed to be. Someone with great skill had expended an enormous amount of chakra to envelop the entire stadium in a wide area sleep compulsion. The genjutsu was, in fact, so widespread that she couldn't really home in on the source of the technique either. With some pride, she noticed Hinata suppressing her own chakra to shed the effects with almost the same speed as her teacher. Ushino's colonies registered the presence of foreign chakra even as he noticed the motion in the stands as the spectators began keeling over. If his assumption was correct and this was a genjutsu effect, it did not seem to extend downward to the examinee balcony. He turned slightly to examine the Suna shinobi using his peripheral vision. Their body language proclaimed that they were tense and expectant, but not surprised by this turn of events. He twitched his fingers to signal Shikamaru as he ordered both his colonies to attack the sand ninjas. If he was incorrect in his projections, he would deal with the consequences later. Kikai bugs poured out from under his jacket, coating the floor as they surged toward the enemies of Konoha. Usabaku no Gaara weaved unsteadily on his feet, clearly disoriented from the beating he'd just taken. However, he had reclaimed his sand and Naruto knew he was back to square one. His opponent's automatic defense wouldn't likely be affected by any dizziness. Moreover, Naruto had no idea how he'd been knocked back like that. Well, he had an idea, but it was too awful to bear thinking about. If Gaara was as hateful and isolated as Hinata guessed, maybe he'd turned to his demon. Gaara wasn't even paying any attention to him at the moment. He just stood there, staring at the blood on his fingertips and whispering to himself. Naruto took a deep breath and brought his hands together for another sweetened jutsu. Even as he was molding his chakra, his attention was diverted by a loud boom as a cloud of smoke enveloped the cage's balcony. His stomach dropped, but he told himself not to worry. Oji-sen wasn't weak, he could take care of himself. As he turned back, Temari and Kankuro leapt down to land on either side of their brother and teammate. They looked like they wanted to steady him, but were afraid of getting too close. He hurt me, Gaara said in a disjointed voice, showing Temari the blood on his fingertips. His eyebrows drew together. He hurt me. Gaara took an unsteady step towards Naruto. Gaara, wait, Temari began, but was cut off when a sand jonin wearing a veil across half of his face landed between them and Naruto. He looked vaguely familiar. Stop this immediately. The mission has started, he said. He turned toward Naruto in his killing intent spite. In a flash, Hayate appeared next to Naruto. Gone was the harassed, sickly-looking referee, and in his place was a focused jonin. Naruto swallowed. Gaara let out a strangled cry and fell to his knees, holding his head. The sand jonin scowled and turned. What's wrong with him? He asked in a harsh voice. Temari hovered over the red-haired genin with a worried expression. He's dazed. He might have a concussion. The armor of sand protected him from a lot of the damage, but it used up most of his chakra. I don't think he can use it anymore. Idiot, spat the sand jonin, who Naruto now recognized from his briefing as Baki, the sand team's jonin sensei. I told him to take this seriously. Gaara is the sand's trump card. Get him out of here until he's had time to recover. Then you will resume the mission. Kankuro gingerly helped Gaara to his feet, hauling an arm across his shoulders. What about you, sensei? Temari asked. I will deal with these, he replied, turning back toward Naruto and Hayate. You think it will be that easy? Hayate asked as another Jonin, this one with a senbon needle in his mouth and cloth tied over his hair, landed next to him. Go! Baki ordered, and they leapt out of there just as a pair of kunai thudded into the ground where they'd been standing. Shino and Shikamaru, kunai in their hands, started after them, but Baki turned toward them with murder in his eyes, and they hesitated. Behind them, Naruto could see a tired Choji puffing toward them, clearly still low on chakra. So, the senbon chewing Jonin said with a lazy grin that never reached his eyes. Is Orochimaru behind this little party? The sound of that name had Naruto baring his teeth. If sensei was right, he owed that freak the beating of his life. Then his eyes wandered up toward the stands. Everyone was lying down like they were asleep or dead. A few people were up, but all of them were fighting. Sensei. I don't know about that, Baki replied, but none of you are leaving this arena alive. We'll handle this, Naruto, Hayate said, stepping between him and Baki. I'm afraid the exam is over now. Right, Genma? The guy with the senbon smirked. Just like old times. Hey, why don't you kids go report to your sensei? I think we're going to need everyone to dance today. Naruto nodded with a grunt. The Jonin closed in on each other as the genin left. Uruka ducked under a kunai as it embedded itself in the wall above him. He was able to recognize the genjutsu and disrupt it before it put him to sleep, but he couldn't remove it from Tuchi or his daughter, or any of the other spectators in their section. He wasn't carrying most of his equipment because of his infiltration mission. The Hyugas might have sensed any weapons and been put on their guard. But the sleeping bodyguard of a fairly prosperous-looking merchant had a short sword he was able to borrow, to good use against shinobi wearing sound hite ite. He heard the explosion and saw the cloud of smoke where the Hokage had been sitting, but he couldn't really spare it any attention. There were enemies right here, threatening helpless civilians from his village. His elaborate kimono bore numerous tears from near misses, and his blade was stained with blood, but he was damned if he was going to abandon them. Uruka dove forward into a roll as two more kunai flew toward him. One nicked his ear, but he ignored the pain as he closed in with a sound ninja that tried to use a substitution technique just an instant too late. The hilt in his hand jolted as he rammed the sword through the ninja's stomach, glancing off the spinal column. Neither Naruto nor Shino wanted to risk getting trapped inside the stairwells. Ignoring their protests, Naruto grabbed Choji while Shino grabbed the back of Shikamaru's mesh shirt and they ran up the arena wall to the stands. Seeing all those people laid out and helpless made Naruto's stomach turn, but he concentrated on looking for motion. He saw Konoha, Suna, and sound shinobi flash from point to point, accompanied by the clang of metal on metal. He tried to remember exactly where Kurenai-sensei was planning to sit when Shino gestured for them to follow him. The four genin cut through 3 sections of seating. Naruto ignored the dead bodies, glad that most of them appeared to be wearing hidden sound insignia. But his stomach flip-flopped when he saw a young girl in civilian clothes with a kunai buried in her stomach, eyes opened in death. She'd never had a chance. Are you sure? Naruto started to ask Shino, but stopped when he saw a shinobi wearing a gray jumpsuit with a mantle made of black and white camouflage material. The Auto Nin turned toward them, raising a kunai when a tree suddenly sprouted from the stands beside him. In an instant, the tree's limbs reached out and engulfed him, twisting his head around as he thrashed. There was a loud crack and the ninja stopped moving. The tree melted away to reveal Kurenai-sensei with her hands around the man's neck, which she quickly released. As the dead ninja fell to the ground, Hinata stepped around her teacher, her Byakugan active. That's the last one here, sensei, she reported in a quiet voice. Naruto let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Team 8 is reporting for duty, Shino said, adjusting his glasses. We appear to have been betrayed by both sound and sand. There was some sort of plan involving Sabaku no Gaara, but it has been derailed by Naruto's action. The sand genin escaped with help from their jonin instructor, who is now fighting 2 konoha jonin. We were instructed by them to report to you for further orders. Kurenai nodded, and then glanced over at Shikamaru and Choji. Yeah, S2, Shikamaru added. Asuma should have known something was up when I forfeited. Have you seen him around? Kurenai shook her head and the lazy genin sighed. Turning to Naruto, Kurenai looked at him intently. Naruto, how are your chakra reserves? Naruto took a deep breath. He didn't feel very tired, but he wasn't quite as fidgety as normal either. Good enough, sensei. Kurenai looked out across the stadium. I don't think any of our forces will be affected, but this genjutsu is rendering a lot of people helpless and we can't evacuate them all. She turned back toward her genin. Naruto, I want you to generate a chakra pulse to dispel this for everyone. Naruto nodded and began focusing his chakra. How far do you want me to push it? He asked in a tight voice. Kurenai frowned. I can't tell from here how far this extends. Push it as far as you can. Naruto closed his eyes to focus, trusting his team to protect him while he was concentrating. He brought his hands together as the pressure below his hara became almost unbearable. He opened his eyes just in time to see Hinata quickly shutting off her Byakugan, holding up a hand to shade her eyes against a bright blue glare. Naruto Majutsu, he growled, feeling his hair stir in an invisible wind, chakra pulse. Naruto had spent every afternoon of the last 3 weeks working on ninjutsu with Jiraiya, the self-styled toad hermit of Konoha. In between cajoling the old pervert to show him new techniques, Naruto had also been engaging in elaborate exercises to develop his chakra control. It shouldn't have been a surprise to him that this might affect how he performed other techniques. But it was. A shockwave pulsed out in all directions, as visible as a thick pane of glass that refracts the light. Shikamaru and Choji grunted as it passed through them, while Shino actually winced. Kuranai and Hinata were standing a little further away, and while the Jonin didn't react, Hinata did blush heavily. But the most visible reactions were among the sleeping spectators, who immediately flinched and woke. Uemino Iruka was on his last legs. His clothing was torn to rags, he was covered with bruises, cuts, and scrapes, and the sword he'd appropriated had just been knocked out of his hand. The sound shinobi he'd fought, who was at least upper chunin if not an actual jonin, wasn't looking that much better. But at least he was still armed. Iruka flung a bloodied hunk of what used to be a 5,000 ryu kimono at the Oto Nin's eyes, but he was too experienced to fall for such a trick. He slashed it out of the air without dropping his guard, cutting off Iruka's escape. Iruka edged back into the corner, warily measuring his opponent's reach with his kunai. He was bracing himself for what would probably be a suicidal rush when a wave of pure chakra passed through him, making him dizzy for a split second. It wasn't enough to distract his opponent, not long enough for him to do anything anyway, but for some reason Iruka felt like he was missing something. The sound ninja shook his head and stepped forward. Whatever that was, it won't be enough, he said in a cocky voice that made Iruka wish for another weapon. Then the Oto Nin stiffened, eyes widening even as he pitched forward on his face. A brace of throwing knives protruded from the back of his tunic. Iruka looked up to see the crowd stirring, civilians as well as some shame-faced chunin and genin. A large man stepped forward, and Iruka recognized him as the guard he'd borrowed the short sword from. He shook his head at Iruka as he kneeled down and wrenched the knives out of the Oto Nin's back with brutal economy. As the folds of his tunic parted, Iruka could see the edge of a hite ite. "I don't suppose you've seen a blade around here. About 3 hands long?" he asked in a gruff voice. Iruka was too tired to be embarrassed. Sakura was vastly relieved when she felt the genjutsu release its hold on those around her. She detected it as it was forming, and she and Sasuke had been able to break it. Kiba wasn't so fast and he and Akamaru had slumped down on the bench. Kakashi-sensei brusquely ordered them both to stay put and guard their teammate while he and Ino's Jonin-sensei fought the sound ninjas that suddenly emerged from the audience. She'd been uncomfortably reminded of their unsuccessful mission to protect Tazuna the bridge builder. Holding a kunai, watching others battle, but knowing if they turned on her she wouldn't last a moment. Something deep inside of her wanted to turn and run from the danger. But she also knew that both Sasuke and her sensei would never truly trust her if she broke now. She'd never be able to look Kiba in the eye if she left him to his fate. So she held her ground and waited for the inevitable. Then a surge of chakra nearly sent her to her knees. There was something familiar about it, but she couldn't really place it. That odd sense of déjà vu was quickly forgotten as the people around her began to wake up, including Kiba and Akamaru. Abruptly, the sound ninja began to withdraw. It was clearly one thing to use superior numbers to face the few elite that resisted the genjutsu. But it was something else when all the chunin and genin joined in as well. Kakashi appem as Kiba was standing up again, shaking his head. "Your mission is now to lead the spectators to the emergency shelters," he said with no preamble. "There are a lot of people here from outside the village who won't know where to go. Once you get them there, you will join the guard force until you are relieved." "Is that clear?" Gone was the playful cajoling tone he'd used so often. In its place was the voice of an anbu captain giving orders in an emergency. Sasuke-kun looked rebellious, but didn't object. Sakura let out a sigh of relief. Outside Konoha, teams of sound shinobi were entering the last phases of a very elaborate sum ritual. Such rituals were necessary to perform a summons that any one of them lacked the requisite chakra to perform. Sitting in precisely delineated positions along and within the sum circles, they had just unfurled their carefully prepared scrolls when a wave of almost solid chakra passed through the clearing. The delicately chakra-infused sum diagrams shattered like spun glass smashed with a sledgehammer. The carefully calibrated sum, designed to call forth one of Manda's oldest offspring, was irrevocably fractured. Instead of Sum, a senior envoy of the snake leader, it called forth thousands of his newest spawn. These newborn snakes were barely larger than a finger, too mindless to understand human speech, and extremely irritable after their first sum. They were also horrifically poisonous. Within 40 seconds every mammal in the clearing was dead. Naruto dropped to his knees, panting for breath. Kuranai could tell he'd put a lot of effort into that technique. Kuranai looked around the Awakening Stadium. "I knew that would be useful someday," she said approvingly. Naruto gave her a tired grin. "While we may have foiled this gambit," Shino said, "I think there is more to their plan than a simple attack." Naruto frowned. "The Sunaku no Ichi, Tamari," she said something about Gaara being too dizzy and exhausted to use it, whatever that means. Their sensei got really angry when he heard that. He said Gaara was the Sand's trump card. Kuranai frowned. This was still potentially dangerous. Where are they now? "They got away," Naruto said with a frown. "Their sensei told them to go, and then stayed to block us." Shino cleared his throat. Naruto turned to Shino. "You tagged Gaara?" "No," Shino replied. "My allies refused to go near him." "Damn," Naruto growled, smacking his fist into his palm. "I did, however, tag the other 2 members of his team when they were on the balcony," Shino clarified, straightening his shoulders and shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "Good work, Shino," Kuranai said. "Finding them quickly without Kikai pheromones would be impossible." "I was merely being proactive based upon cues I received from Naruto," Shino replied evenly. "You're still a sneaky bastard," Naruto said with a weak laugh, "and you freaking rock." "Very well," Kuranai said, thinking for a moment. "Naruto, your strategy against Gaara seemed fairly effective and it doesn't appear that he's recovered yet. You and Shino take Shikamaru and try to run them down before they can try anything else. Choji, you seem a little tired, so we will link up with Asuma and any other Jonin we meet. Now that I know what to look for, if their genjutsu user tries to start this again, I should be able to locate them. Are there any questions?" The genin shook their heads, Shikamaru perhaps a bit less than enthusiastically. "Good. Stay alert and be careful out there," she said. "Now go." The 3 boys quickly made their way to the exit. Even Asuma's laziest student showed some haste. Hinata started after them when Kuranai grabbed her shoulder. "Hinata, I don't think you are." "They might need my eyes, sensei," Hinata replied, turning toward her. "I will not get in their way or slow them down." The girl's face showed an implacable resolve that robbed Kuranai of any desire to stop her. She'd never seen the soft-spoken Hyuga looking quite so fierce. "Then hurry, Hinata," Kuranai ordered. "But be careful." Chapter 18. Tamari set as hard a pace as she could manage with Gaara as they tried to slip out of Konoha as quickly as possible. Just thinking about needing to slow down for Gaara had her suppressing hysterical laughter. She'd never had what you could call a normal family life. Her father treated his children like his personal soldiers. Lives to be expended furthering his ambitions. Just thinking about her mother's fate drove that point home. Neither of her brothers were anything close to normal, but it said a lot that she had a closer relationship to the one that wore more makeup than she did. Her relationship with Gaara was normally built around fear. Fear of his anger. Fear of inciting his automatic defense to lash out. Fear of being hurt. Her first memory of him was that of a cute baby with strange eyes, but it wasn't until Gaara had killed her uncle that she really understood. The demon inside her brother ruled his existence. Only her loyalty as a Sunaku no Ichi prevented her from actively hating her father for what he'd ordered Chiyo-sama to do to her brother, as well as to her mother. But that fear had also brought with it a sense of confidence. Sabaku no Gaara was simply unstoppable. In every mission that her team had performed, he'd never even been scratched. As long as she and Kankuro stayed on Gaara's good side, they shared in that strength. With Gaara on their team, they were unbeatable. Until Konoha. The first sign came during the second exam, with the manhandling they'd received from a small horde of fearless clones that overran their ambush as they waited for unsuspecting genin near the tower. There were so many, and they came so fast that the blonde one actually got his hands on Gaara before his sand lashed out and destroyed them all. She never thought she'd see anyone run their knuckles across his scalp like that. Even if he couldn't feel it through his armor of sand, the concept was simply ludicrous. But it was more like a glimpse of things to come. Her match had gone about as well as could be expected. She hadn't had to display any abilities someone couldn't guess from just seeing her battle fan. Kankuro being the odd man out and not having to fight was just a stroke of luck. Gaara's fight was actually the hardest. That weird kid in the green stretchy suit was incredibly fast, and for a while there Gaara hadn't been able to touch him. But eventually the kid had gotten winded and his sensei stopped the match before Gaara could kill him. That only made her brother angrier. She hadn't paid too much attention to the kid whose clone had gone after Gaara outside. He did score the quickest victory in the preliminary matches. But at first, she just thought his opponent had been overrated or hurt. Now she wondered if her twinge of fear hadn't been caused by Gaara's lingering frustration. She was almost looking forward to Gaara's first match in the finals, hoping a little bloodshed would calm him down before they needed to use his other half. It wasn't like it really mattered how many he killed. They'd just as likely die in the attack anyway. She was not going to question the Case Cage's decision to turn on Konoha, and calming Gaara down was something she considered a very good cause. What she hadn't expected to see was her youngest brother getting beaten like an unwanted stepchild. This Uzumaki kid had obviously done his homework during the preceding month. He'd handled that Hyuga like he was nothing, and left him bleeding in the dirt, but she didn't expect to see someone ever fight Gaara so effectively. His attacks tied up most of Gaara's sand, making his automatic defense less and less effective. That swamp sum jutsu had to have been Jonin level, and, with all of the clones he had created, she wondered if he was a ringer inserted into the test to take Gaara out. Had Konoha ferreted out their treacherous alliance with Hokage? In any event, Uzumaki had really battered Gaara, right through the armor of sand, before her brother could reclaim most of his sand. He'd finally had to draw on Shukaku for a moment to even get some breathing room. Between that and maintaining his armor through that ferocious beating, Gaara's chakra reserves were depleted worse than she could ever remember. Aside from the surprises in the arena, the changes within herself were no less striking. She found she couldn't watch the match with the dispassionate gaze of a professional kunoichi. This was her youngest brother being battered left and right. This was her mother's last child getting punched so hard he was launched backward off his feet. It didn't matter if his demon made him a psychotic killer when he became angry, or bored, he was still her blood. It was almost a relief when she felt the genjutsu start and the creepy bug guy tried to attack them. Watching helplessly galled her more than she wanted to admit. Leaping down into the arena before his bugs could catch her, she'd still been surprised to see Gaara so weak and disoriented. He had actually needed her help to stand up straight. He needed her. She tightened her grip around Gaara's shoulders as they leapt from a rooftop to the outer wall. Kankuro was on point, ready to unleash fully articulated hell on anyone that got in their way, but Konoha's defenders were concentrating on the people leaping into their village, not out. She almost stumbled in surprise when Gaara's hand tightened for a moment on her shoulder. She could sense that his chakra reserves were replenishing moment by moment. Hopefully his head would clear as well. They still had a mission to perform, one vital to the success of the attack. But with respect to Sabaku no Gaara, her fear of him was slowly being counterbalanced by fear for him. Ushino was on point, since they were following the scent trails of his bugs. Hinata was right behind him, using her Byakugan to warn of any ambushes. Shikamaru trailed behind her, grumbling at the pace they set, while Naruto brought up the rear, along with half a dozen clones running interference. Normally, he'd have made more, but Shino reminded him that they didn't want to gather too much attention from unknown hostile forces. Not that it stopped him from dropping 20 or 30 clones every time a foreign shinobi even looked at them funny. The extra clones were instructed not to follow them, but to instead help Konoha's defenders. The scattered reports as they were dispelled painted an interesting picture. The Suna guys were tough as hell, but the more numerous sound shinobi didn't seem to be quite as well trained. Taijutsu training aside, he never expected 30 of his clones to be able to disable a Jonin, even if they got extremely lucky. The first time it happened, he nearly stumbled when he received the memories, but he couldn't imagine them letting lower-ranked ninja operate alone. Well, even if they did act stupidly, including attacking Konoha like this, he'd still tell Kurenai-sensei about it. Her and Gai-sensei's efforts hadn't been wasted. After the second set of clones had been dispatched to help out a team of Chunin, Shikamaru dropped back for a moment and began talking to the clone in the center of the shifting formation. "Naruto, just how many times can you do that before you start running low on chakra?" the lazy genin asked. That clone and two others nearby turned their heads along with Naruto. His classmate's tone was thoughtful, but with an undercurrent of worry. "I don't know," the clone replied. Naruto decided to let it do the talking, since it was the one Shikamaru addressed. "You still can't gauge your own chakra?" Shikamaru asked in a disgusted voice. Naruto frowned. His chakra control wasn't that bad. A stray kunai nicked the clone, dispelling it. Receiving its memories, Naruto knew it was just as annoyed as he was by the implication. Turning, he saw another pitched battle between two sound ninjas and an anbu with long purple hair and a cat mask. "Kage Bunshin no Jutsu," he snarled, and 30 clones appeared in his wake, immediately vectoring towards the melee. He turned toward Shikamaru, who was shoulder at him. "No, it just didn't drain me enough to notice," he said sarcastically. Shikamaru grunted something under his breath that Naruto didn't really want to hear and moved back up in the formation. When they left the stadium, Shino told him to be ready to immobilize any dangerous enemies, and he'd acquiesced to that role with a shrug and a wave. Naruto figured he found this whole situation to be too troublesome for words. Uezuki Yugao landed a solid kick right on the sound ninja's forehead protector, dropping him like a rock. Spinning towards his partner, she brought her sword around in a wheel cut that had him leaping backwards to avoid evisceration. Striding forward in a deep stance, she was just beginning her follow-up attack when the scrape of metal on stone warned her that the first ninja was only faking. She was pivoting back toward the threat when a third ninja slammed into her, knocking her off her feet. Striking the roof knocked her anbu mask slightly askew, so she only got a glimpse of the blonde-haired enemy's face before he exploded into a cloud of smoke. An instant later, the wedge of nearly solid sound waves that passed through the Kage Bunshin slammed into the roof just past her head, sending fragments of clay tiles flying through the air. Yugao rolled to her feet, blade up in a defensive posture. but found both of her opponents fully occupied by over a dozen clones each. The green-clad genin were displaying some impressive taijutsu skills, each one dodging like crazy to avoid being disrupted. At first glance she had no idea which one was the real one, but she'd take any help she could get. Bringing up her blade for a lunge, she closed in on the one who'd been faking before. He evidently saw her coming out of the corner of his eye, because he spun to avoid the attack, raising the shiny metal devices on his wrists. Only to have two of the clones kick the backs of his knees, pitching him forward to be neatly impaled on her blade. He dropped to his knees, vomiting blood, and slowly toppled backward off her sword. The other sound ninja was taking a beating from the clones, but managed to dispel 6 of them. He didn't see Yugo's leaping strike before it was too late. Turning to the clones, she took a deep breath. "Thanks, but who are you?" Most of the clones were warily scanning the rooftops around them, but one in the middle folded his arms and announced, in a deep growling voice, "We are Legion." The 2 clones nearest to the speaker both turned to look at him. He shrugged. The one on the left smacked the back of his head and he disappeared in a cloud of smoke. The one on the right just shook his head. "Sorry, Anbu-san. We're clones of Uzumaki Naruto. He assigned us to help you for as long as we last." Yugao blinked. "You're all clones? Then where is he?" "Chasing the Cage's children," the clone answered sourly. The anbu prowled around the edges of an elaborate chakra barrier that had been erected on top of one of the arena buildings. The Hokage and the man who'd been disguised as the Cage were both inside, but they had no way through the deadly energy. The only success they'd experienced was when that odd wave of chakra had washed over the roof. The barrier had fluctuated for a moment, thinning out in some areas. A single hole large enough for a person had appeared, but only for a split second. Only one shinobi had been quick enough and near enough to exploit that weakness, one of Ibiki's chunin wearing a proctor uniform. Now the Hokage wasn't alone, but it wasn't enough, especially since they could now see that his attacker was none other than Orochimaru, his former student. Some anbu had already gone through the interior of the building, seeking to break through the roof from below. However, the barrier had reinforced the roof substrate with that same deadly energy, which had almost killed the first one to attempt a jutsu to breach it. The anbu stationed at the arena were left to prowl around the edge of the barrier like restless wolves, looking for any sign of weakness. The few enemies still within the arena were being dealt with by konoha genin, chunin, and a couple of jonin. To make things worse for the treacherous enemy, many visiting dignitaries had their own contingents of bodyguards. None of them were very happy about being put to sleep. No, the Hokage's need was greater. He was fighting a deadly enemy and none of them could help. What use would a mere chunin be in such a battle? Things went fairly smoothly for Naruto and his friends until they entered the forest surrounding Konoha. They were barely past the walls before Hinata signaled they had pursuers. Shikamaru offered to hang back to delay them, but Naruto shook his head. "Shino, can we afford a couple of minutes?" he asked. Shino nodded. "We've been steadily gaining. They won't get out of my range that quickly." After a quick whispered consultation, they dropped down to the forest floor, traveled a little further, and then took cover. Naruto got a little worried when 8 auto nins ran into the clearing, but Shikamaru managed to snag all of them with his shadow. It looked like Temari hadn't been the only one holding back earlier. No sooner had they jerked to a halt than the Kikai bugs Shino had spread in the branches above them descended like black ashes. Naruto smiled at the chagrined expressions he could see on what little of their faces was visible. "Naruto. Above and right." Hinata's voice snapped like a whip crack. Her normal hesitancy and manners were nowhere to be found. Naruto and his remaining clones were moving before what she'd said even registered. One of Shino's kamas deflected a thrown kunai right before it pierced Shikamaru's head, but a 9th sound ninja was hurtling down out of the canopy behind it. 2 of Naruto's clones were dispelled in midair, not even slowing the man down. But they distracted him just enough for Naruto himself to get a clear shot. His leaping uppercut slammed into the underside of the man's jaw before his feet even touched the ground. His head snapped back as his momentum reversed itself. Naruto channeled his body's rotation into a spinning back kick that drove his heel into the ribcage of the already rising shinobi. There were multiple cracks as the man catapulted backward. His flight was stopped by the tree trunk he impacted with a dull thud. He crumpled to the ground and did not move. Naruto landed in a deep crouch, his feet kicking up dust as he finished his spinning motion. He wondered what Lee would think of his version of Konoha Senpu. One glance at his target and he was pretty sure he wouldn't be moving anytime soon. Looking back at the rest of the enemy, he saw that Shikamaru hadn't flinched or released any of his victims. Each of them had Kikai bugs crawling across their heads and shoulders, and none of them could even move as long as they were held by Shikamaru's Kagemain no Jutsu. Within 30 seconds of the start of the ambush, they were trembling. At 45 seconds their eyes rolled back in their heads and they slumped in place. Shikamaru released his shadow bind and they collapsed bonelessly to the forest floor. "They won't be capable of movement today without medical assistance," Shino said as he recalled his bugs. "But they may hold information valuable to Konoha. We should resume our pursuit." Shikamaru shook his head when Hinata offered him the small packet of pills and canteen she fished out of her bag. He sighed as they took to the trees again. That was less troublesome than it should have been, he muttered. But now they will expect us to do things like this all the time, and that is even more troublesome. Naruto snorted. It was nice to see someone keeping their perspective on things. The Sandaime paused to catch his breath. The black uniform he wore under his formal robes seemed to fit a little looser every day, but at least the metal arm guards and kabuto protecting his head were still secure. He'd been able to stop the resurrection of his successor, but Orochimaru had still success foot and second Hokages. But just as he had been about to insert the tagged kunai that would bind them to his service, the entire barrier rang like a great bell, going from dark purple to blood red for an instant. In a flash, a blur he barely recognized as Ibiki's newest apprentice managed to breach the barrier. More importantly, his senbon ripped through the prepared tags dangling from the kunai in Orochimaru's hands. Sarutobi's most disappointing student was momentarily caught off guard, but the rage visible on his face when he realized what had happened was gratifying. Sarutobi launched the jutsu he'd been building up the chakra for as the boy leapt clear. A grand fireball forced the snake Sannin to leap back as well, but the motionless bodies burned to ash. The old man turned to look at his former student. The second greatest regret of the Sandaime's life was allowing Orochimaru to flee Konoha when his crimes were exposed. Some part of him still remembered the boy he had trained, but it died a little more every time rumors of new atrocities reached his ears. The murder and impersonation of the case cage was merely the latest, and now he threatened the village Sarutobi loved. "Stay clear of this," he murmured to Haku. A strange boy, but one he was glad he'd taken a chance on. "I will not allow you to be harmed, Hokage-sama," Haku whispered. "Your life will not end before mine." The air chilled around the Chunin as the moisture within the air crystallized. The Hokage shook his head at the boy's stubbornness. Some had questioned the wisdom of allowing Kakashi's prisoner a place within the leaf, but his mercy was being repaid 1,000-fold today. However, he would not allow another person to die for Orochimaru's ambitions. He hefted his battle staff, the alternate form of his summons, Enma the Monkey King, and prepared himself. Utamari called for Kankuro to stop when Gaara grabbed her shoulder again. Worried that he was concussed worse than she thought, she carefully landed them both in the nearest clearing. "Are you all right?" she asked in an urgent whisper. Get away," Gaara murmured. "What?" she asked. She wondered if it was already starting. "Get away," Gaara screamed, roughly shoving her aside. She stumbled back, almost dropping her fan. Then she noticed the shadows landing on the tree limbs overhead, almost obscured by the greenery. "Mother wants blood," Gaara rasped, holding his head. Tamari edged away from the clearing, following Kankuro. Their original plan was to get far away as soon as Gaara started to use it. Now she was not as assured of Gaara's invincibility. She shook her head when Kankuro tugged on her sleeve. Naruto frowned as he watched Gaara's brother and sister move away from him. Even if they were enemies, it bothered him that they seemed ready to abandon him. He thought again about Hinata's guesses as to why Sabaku no Gaara was so bloodthirsty and shivered a little. To be totally alone, with absolutely no one precious to him? It was with mixed feelings that he saw the fan and puppet users hauled at the edge of the clearing. It might make it harder for his team to deal with Gaara, but watching them simply abandon him would be disgusting as well. "You have betrayed your village's alliance with Konoha," Shino said, interrupting Naruto's thoughts. "Our assignment is to place you under arrest if possible, or terminate you otherwise. Immediate surrender is your most logical option." Gaara screamed again, and Naruto suddenly realized why Tamari and Kankuro had moved away from their brother. The sand from his seemingly inexhaustible gourd began to flow out, covering his body in a tan-colored mass that looked disturbingly like flesh, complete with weird blue markings. Already one arm was completely covered with sand, forming a huge misshapen claw way out of proportion to the rest of Gaara's body. But instead of being unbalanced, he shot forward with surprising speed, smashing through the trunk of the tree they were standing on. All four of them scattered, but Naruto leapt down into the clearing. Taking down Gaara was his job. His team would make sure the others didn't interfere. Hinata felt her stomach twist as the air seemed to swell with unnatural chakra and insatiable bloodlust. Gaara was in the midst of some monstrous transformation, and she wasn't sure there was any way they could stop it. Of course, that didn't keep Naruto-kun from trying. Her own hesitancy vanished when she saw the Tsunaku no Ichi angling to take a shot at her teammate with her enormous fan. She wasn't really equipped up for a mission, but she was far from helpless. No Hyuga was ever truly unarmed. Tamari leapt aside right before Hinata landed on her, chakra flaring from her hands. "You will not harm Naruto-kun," Hinata snapped in a voice she barely recognized. The older blonde girl's lip curled in annoyance. "Do you really think you can stop me?" Hinata stared at her with her Byakugan, taking in every detail, every nuance of her foe's appearance. She wasn't as good at reading people as she should be, but she was pretty sure Tamari was anxious about something, even more than would be normal for combat circumstances. She thought of her father's voice when he was quietly angry with someone, the forbidding but restrained tone. When she spoke, she tried her best to assume that voice. Naruto will stop Gaara and I will stop you. It was a pathetic attempt, really, but it still made the older girl flinch a little. Kankuro wasn't quite as quick to move in, but neither Shino nor Shikamaru thought he'd abandon his team. A multi-limbed apparition of wood and cloth descended from the trees, angling toward Naruto's back, right up until Shikamaru's shadow reached out and captured it. How long can you restrain his proxy? Shino asked in a whisper. Shikamaru didn't answer directly, but twitched 3 of his fingers together as sweat began to bead on his forehead. A mass of Shino's bugs descended onto the wooden puppet, intent on rendering it down to sawdust. However, no sooner did they reach it than a small door opened in the side of its chest and dark purple mist spewed out, killing them almost instantly. Ooh, damn, that is one ugly technique, Naruto said as he dodged Gaara's misshapen claw. It slammed down into the forest loam, compressing it nearly a foot. If anything, Gaara moved faster, despite all the extra flesh, and it was spreading out over his body as well. Particularly disturbing was the portion starting to cover his face. One eye had been covered with something sporting a monstrous diamond-shaped pupil. That eye had locked onto him with an alien hunger Naruto could feel in the pit of his stomach. Naruto put his hands together and began creating clones as quickly as he could, even as he leapt backward from another swipe. Growing old, the Sandaime reflected, is not an occupation for the weak. He struggled to regain his breath and glanced around. The canted roof of the arena building looked like a war zone. Craters had been blasted into the tiles, and fragments of scorched clay ground under their feet like gritty ashes. The barrier, however, was still completely unmarked. His former student had planned well, intending their confrontation to occur in such an enclosure meant no one could intervene, as well as limiting his options to disengage. However, that also meant that Orochimaru was similarly limited, even if his arrogance blinded him to that fact. Haku flitted around the periphery, never missing an opportunity to attack or distract Orochimaru. As a near miss made their enemy turn toward the boy, Sarutobi began another technique. Haku barely managed to dodge the summoned snakes that shot out of Orochimaru's sleeves. But the distraction was sufficient to let the Sandaime complete his technique without hurrying too much, and the blasted tiles surged upward into a wave that sped toward Orochimaru. Given a little extra time, Sarutobi could select his attacks with care, carefully managing his chakra reserves for maximum effect. The fact that Orochimaru suggested that rushing the old man had been part of his strategy. Foiling this tactic made his rage even more satisfying. This Hokage had put up with enough nonsense. Orochimaru started to counter the modified Dodenjutsu. But hand seals are a little difficult to complete when you suddenly find senbon needles shooting toward your vital points. With a strangled cry, he threw himself to the side as the tiles exploded where he was standing. He fluidly rolled to his feet, holding his wrist. He yanked out the needle and shot a venomous glance at the Hokage. I see you still need a young boy to keep up with me, he snarled, his voice thick with insinuation. I wonder what your lackeys think of you now. Whatever the years had stolen from the third Hokage's speed, young Haku more than made up for. The Chunin hadn't pressed the attack so far, more likely out of deference to his superior than any real fear. But Orochimaru seemed to find it increasingly difficult to complete the seals for his techniques. The confined nature of the conflict also limited his ability to complete a technique from cover. But now, icy needles crystallized out of midair around the Chunin and shot toward the Sannin almost too fast to see. In a flash, he was riddled with senbon, falling to the ground with his breathing and heart stopped. Only to dissolve into a mass of mud as the substitution technique expired. Orochimaru emerged from a crater in the tiled roof behind them. With a growl of frustration he drew a straight-bladed sword from his own mouth and charged directly toward Haku. His speed was such that Sarutobi had to push himself to block the strike with his battle staff. That blade is poisoned, Enma growled, opening an eye between Sarutobi's hands. Orochimaru's swordsmanship was much better than Sarutobi remembered, but that was hardly surprising given the time that had passed. The scowling snake Sannin launched a combination of cuts that Sarutobi barely managed to block, though he was forced backward several steps. Haku circled warily, careful to stay out of the blade's reach. His hands blurred together in a series of seals, executed with speed that Sarutobi found surprising in someone so young. With Enma helping, the third blocked a wheel cut with enough force to stagger his foe, and then went on the offensive. Sarutobi ignored the chill in the air that made his facial skin tighten as his young ally formed a dome of ice mirrors around them. A barrier within the barrier, and Orochimaru directly in the middle. Naruto dodged another clumsy but terrifyingly fast lunge from Sabaku no Gaara as he distributed autonomous clones all around the clearing. They'd been useful against Orochimaru, so he hoped they'd work here as well. Even as he prepared, more and more sand flowed over Gaara's body, further transforming him into something out of an expired milk nightmare. One great golden eye rolled crazily in the socket as the misshapen creature flailed around the clearing, smashing anything between it and Naruto. The blonde couldn't help but stare as the monster's form grew larger by the second. For a moment, Naruto wondered if the missing nins he'd killed had looked at him the same way. He shook his head and leapt to the side as Hinata shouted a warning. There was enough danger here without distracting his friends by acting stupid. For a moment, he wondered how she knew which one was him. Then it hit him. He was the only one making more clones. Idiot. The next batch all mimicked the seals the next time he did Kage Bunshin. Gaara screamed his frustration in a voice loud enough to shake leaves from the trees. He swept his misshapen arm in a circle and the claw of sand detached, shooting out toward Hinata. The nearest clones were only beginning to react when she backflipped out of the way, letting the sand smack harmlessly into the bole of a massive tree. Naruto didn't even have to tell his clones to attack. Hinata was growing increasingly frustrated with her opponent. Temari obviously had extensive training as a distance fighter, and used every bit of that training to maintain the distance between them. In a long-range fight, her Jukin was practically useless. Of course, it wasn't all one-sided. Hinata's agility, honed by hours and hours of training, made it almost impossible for Temari to catch her with one of her wind blasts. Unlike her earlier battle with Tenten, now Temari was fighting in a heavily forested area and the Hyuga always had cover available. But Hinata was never so glad of her Hyuga heritage when, right after shouting a warning to Naruto-kun, her eyes helped her track and avoid the sand Gaara had hurled at her. She swallowed heavily when she saw it smash the bark from the tree it struck. "You kids are going to get killed if you stick around," Temari shouted at her. Hinata's ears weren't as well trained as her eyes, but, mixed in with the sincerity in the kunoichi's voice, she thought she detected undercurrents of fear and anxiety as well. "I am a kunoichi of the leaf," Hinata announced in a chilly formal tone. "My sensei has ordered my team to apprehend yours. We will succeed." She hoped the nearby clones were watching. She wouldn't let her team down again. Uchiha was mostly conserving his chakra. This was something he had a lot of practice doing. Sometimes he'd spend entire days just conserving his chakra. But that didn't stop him from flicking out his shadow every so often to trip up that freaky puppet. After watching the damn thing spew out a cloud of poison gas, neither he nor Shino were eager to get too close to the thing. The Aburame was pretty adamant about shutting down the puppet master though. He could have sworn the boy was looking to avenge his dead bugs, if the idea wasn't patently absurd. Shino and the puppet were dancing around, leaping from branch to branch, in an exercise that looked far too troublesome for him to join. He knew without guessing that it was just a distraction while Shino's bugs closed in on the puppet master. On the other hand, they'd also tipped their hand a little on the balcony. A wave of angry Kikai bugs tended to make an impression on people. If Kankuro and Temari hadn't been obviously set to jump the instant that Genjutsu swept the stadium, the bugs might have caught them before they cleared the railing and forestalled this whole troublesome mess. Of course, watching Gaara continue to change out of the corner of his eye, Shikamaru wondered if chasing him out here might have been less of a pain than dealing with him back in Konoha. Despite just missing them, Shino's attack had obviously given Kankuro some warning of what to expect. The puppet user seemed to be moving around a lot himself. Maybe he was keeping an eye out for more bugs. Shikamaru ducked as the puppet suddenly whirled away from Shino and launched a spring-propelled spike right at his head. "Maybe I'd better pay more attention," Shikamaru said with a grunt as he edged away from the melee, looking for any sign of the puppet master. How troublesome. Clones poured out of the trees, swarming toward the steadily growing monster that was Sabaku no Gaara. The body of the Kage's son wasn't really visible within the huge mass of sand that was already as tall as the Hokage's tower, but that didn't stop the whole thing from flailing around like a wild animal, knocking down trees in an ever-widening radius. Even weirder were the high-pitched cries echoing from within the mass of sand. The occasional yips didn't sound even remotely human, more like a raccoon or a tanuki. The damn thing looked more and more like one of those odd little raccoon dogs. It was so weird it was almost funny. But that didn't stop it from obliterating the first row of clones to reach it. Naruto ignored the memories of incredible pressure as they expired and circled around behind the monstrosity. 8 kunai with explosive tags made a neat circle as they embedded in the behemoth's back. The massive explosion when they triggered made the still expanding sand tanuki stumble forward, and the creature's back was already filling in before Naruto's eyes. A tail almost as large as his apartment building swept out and crushed the trunk of the tree where Naruto was perched. The surprised genin was pitched forward, along with several tons of tree. Some hastily created clones were able to hurl him free of the falling debris. Right into the grasp of the sand demon's left forepaw. Hinata screamed when she saw Naruto caught and crushed within Gaara's paw. From the way the clones had acted to save that particular one, she knew it was the real Naruto. Temari obviously wasn't a kunoichi to ignore golden opportunities, because her wind blast caught the distracted Hyuga and slammed her into a tree trunk. Stunned by what she'd seen as much as by the impact, Hinata struggled to her hands and knees as the sand girl moved in to finish her off. A large hunk of wood slammed into the puppet, knocking it off balance and giving Shikamaru time to jump clear. Shino dropped down from above, one of his kama held in both hands, poised to swing down and do as much damage as possible to the wooden puppet while it was off balance. A spike emerged from the puppet's back, shooting out to impale the aburame. Shino's kama fell from his suddenly lax fingers and stuck in the tree limb with a muted thump. Naruto barely had time to take a breath before the paw closed. As the chakra-controlled sand of Gaara's new body flowed around him, a flash of inspiration struck. As the pressure mounted with frightening speed, he frantically concentrated chakra into the center of his coils. "Fox, if you don't want to die here today, you damn well better help." Kyuubi no Kitsune seemed awfully well informed to Naruto. Too knowledgeable by far to not be at least peripherally aware of what was going on around his prison. The surge of red chakra that slammed through his coils only confirmed this. For an instant, his veins felt like they were full of molten steel. Naruto couldn't help but scream as he released the technique, even if sand did start to pour into his mouth. Utamari pulled out a kunai as the stunned kunoichi crawled around a tree in a pathetic attempt to avoid her fate. She didn't relish killing, but orders were orders and her brother. She shook her head and stepped around the trunk. The Hyuga girl was still on all fours. For someone her teammates had defended so fiercely as not being weak, she sure hadn't shown much strength. She shook her head and steeled herself for what she had to do. And then she heard the thing her brother had turned into let out a shrill scream as its left arm exploded. Temari's eyes widened as sand rained down all across the forest. The defeated Hyuga at her feet disappeared in a puff of vapor and Hyuga Hinata came charging down the tree trunk, her left hand spearing out in a juken strike. Kankuro grinned under his face paint. One down and one to go. His fingers twitched and one of Karasu's segmented arms looped out, reaching for his other victim. Then the impaled genin on Karasu's back, who looked like a fitting trophy, exploded into a mass of bugs that immediately began burrowing into Kankuro's pride and joy. "What the hell?" he murmured. His eyes glanced back toward the kama stuck in the tree limb. It was still there. Did aburames just turn into bugs when they died? An effective tactic to reinforce the illusion of the Kikai Bunshin, a voice proclaimed just as a blinding pain erupted in the side of Kankuro's head. It took an instant before he realized he'd just been clubbed in the head. The Suna genin crumpled forward, allowing himself to fall off the limb where he'd been concealed. A twitch of his fingers in free fall was enough to summon the heavily damaged Karasu to catch him. At the moment, he wasn't capable of finer manipulations, so he sagged to the ground to play for time. "How did you find me? Even if they can smell me, I moved every time I saw your damn bugs get close." "You are correct in that my allies can track you by scent," the creepy bastard said as he cautiously moved in. "However, the bugs within my body are more than capable of tracking that scent as well, and I can move somewhat faster when the situation calls for it." The lazy bastard that fought Tamari landed next to the creepy one and handed him the kama. "Loaning a weapon to your bunshin was smart," Kankuro admitted as his vision began to clear. "Creepy or not, that bastard hit harder than Tamari at her time of the month. When I saw it was solid, I thought I had you." Kankuro blinked away the last of the double images. "Just like you think you have me," he said as he dropped the smoke bomb he'd pawned. The Hokage ducked under a strike that would otherwise have decapitated him. He was starting to wonder if going hand to hand with his much younger student was such a good idea. He was off balance to parry Orochimaru's follow-up backhand cut, but a senbon needle forestalled the attack by protruding from the rogue ninja's elbow. Haku was flashing from mirror to mirror faster than the eye could see, peppering Orochimaru with throwing needles every time he had a clear shot. It was a major distraction, and just enough to keep them on an even footing. Even as Orochimaru yanked out the needle with a snarl, Sarutobi brought Enma's staff form around at knee level. The snake summoner, his attention momentarily on the supremely annoying Chunin, was an instant too slow dodging backward. With a crunch of bone, he was swept off his feet, sword flying into the air as he landed in a crumpled heap near the edge of the ice mirrors. Sarutobi drew in a ragged breath as he looked around, wary for substitution techniques or other tricks. Orochimaru let out a low groan, but did nothing else. Slowly the old man approached his former student. Naruto spat out the sodden sand as he tumbled through the air. He hadn't expected that to work so well, but he guessed the way the sand wrapped around him magnified the effect of the pulse. Opening his eyes to orient himself, he saw a flash of red atop the beige juggernaut. It was Gaara's hair. The upper half of his body was sticking out of the sand demon's forehead like some kind of reversed pimple. He looked to be dead or asleep, but he was pretty sure Gaara being dead would kill the demon too. So why was he asleep? The rapidly approaching ground jolted him out of his thoughts. He quickly formed another batch of clones, finally beginning to feel a little drained after the countless hordes he'd created, not to mention 2 full-strength chakra pulses. He wondered briefly if this was how everyone else felt all of the time. Why does almost getting killed make me so thoughtful? Naruto wondered as a clone grabbed the sleeve of his jacket and hurled him toward another clone. "Gaara!" A voice screamed from below. Naruto's head pivoted even as another clone caught him and hurled him toward the others waiting on a tree trunk. The blonde Tsunaku no Ichi ran out into the clearing, ignoring the sand still raining down from the explosion. She stopped and swung her fan behind her, blasting a wind attack back the way she'd come. However, the technique came out very weak. One of her arms didn't seem to be working right and an entire section of her fan had the paper torn out. Then he saw Hinata emerge from the trees, rolling to the side to avoid the attack. She was sweating and breathing heavily, but her eyes were hard as diamonds. Naruto didn't think he'd ever been so proud to be her teammate. Naruto shook his head to clear it as he landed on the side of a tree trunk, hanging there by the chakra in his hands and feet. With them fighting this close to Gaara, he needed to end this quickly. Naruto ran down the bole of the ancient tree, letting gravity accelerate him even more. He saw Shino and Shikamaru chasing a battered wooden puppet out of the corner of his eye, but their presence here only hardened his resolve. The sand demon's wails were trailing off, only to be replaced by shrieks of rage. Behind him, Naruto heard Tamari shouting as L-clones were drawn into the running battle between her and Hinata. The memories he received as they were dispersed made his stomach hurt. The anguish on the girl's face bothered him, but it wouldn't stop him from killing her brother. Usarutobi stared down at the man who'd once been his hope for the future of Konoha. But that was a long time ago, and now he'd become more of a nightmare. "Are you going to gloat now, old man?" Orochimaru demanded with a sibilant rasp. The bones protruding from his shattered legs were a sickening sight, but a relief as well. He wasn't sure how much longer he could have kept up with him. "I take no pleasure in this," Sarutobi murmured as he hefted his staff. His former student appeared to have also suffered spinal damage from his landing. His left arm was outstretched at his side, only the fingertips twitching. For a moment he considered just taking him prisoner, but he ruthlessly crushed the thought. As long as that genius brain was alive, Orochimaru would be a deadly threat. He raised his battle staff. At least he could give his greatest failure a quick end. An eye popped open on the staff between his hands. "Look out behind you," Enma shouted. Sarutobi spun. Orochimaru's sword wrenched itself free of the tiles where it had landed and hurtled through the air at him. His eyes barely had time to see this before the view was blocked. Haku was now standing between him and Poisoned Blade. When Naruto reached the forest floor, he switched to horizontal travel without slowing. Once he was no longer flirting with free fall. A quick thump to his weight releases sped him up until the greenery at the edges of his vision blurred. He could feel his other chakra, still agitated from the chakra pulse, surging through his coils, seeking release. His fists trembled with a desire to punish Gaara, to beat him senseless for threatening his village, his friends. The reddish tint sliding across his eyes, even as his sense of smell became even more acute, scared Naruto almost as badly as the monster in front of him. The demon inside him was something he could never escape. Gritting his teeth as he closed in on the screaming monster, he forced the red chakra down into his feet, away from his head. Naruto could tell his prisoner didn't like that one bit, and the chakra surged even harder for a moment. But he had more important things to worry about, because he was now running up the side of the giant sand tanuki's ankle, using the extra chakra to maintain traction. The red chakra was actually helping, because he noticed that the sand seemed to absorb a lot more chakra than was normally required to maintain contact on a vertical surface. He hoped he could move quickly enough to reach Gaara before the sand grabbed him. But as he ran up the demon's leg, he noticed that while the sand near him surged toward him, the stuff immediately around his feet stayed still. Still, the sand farther away was reacting to his intrusion, rearing up and arcing forward to crush him like a bug. He poured on the speed as he climbed the bulging torso, past the arm that was still reforming even as it ponderously swung down at him. Naruto changed direction with a sharpness only someone gluing themselves down with chakra could manage, angling toward the opposite shoulder. The whole world seemed to shudder as the demon's arm slammed into its own stomach, yards behind the charging genin. Even as the demon yowled at ear-splitting volumes, Naruto saw the sand ahead of him rearing up like a wave. The sand tsunami crashed down across the monster's chest, but Naruto had changed directions again. He was breathing so hard he couldn't hear anything else, but he finally made it onto the demon's shoulder. But the closer he came to the demon's head, the quicker it seemed to react. Sand began to spring up all around him in grasping tendrils, so he crouched down and leapt upward right before they smashed down on him. Naruto's awkward and hasty jump got him clear of the trap, but now he was airborne and helpless. However, he was also very close to his objective. He arched his back as he carefully molded chakra. Slowly turning in the air, he got a very close look at a face several meters wide, complete with freaky diamond-pupiled eyes that were crossing trying to see him. Then he was past them, drawing closer and closer to the forehead. Naruto completed the seals and then stuck out his arm and braced himself for impact. Raiden. Shakingu Haji, Sarutobi was moving before what he saw fully registered. His left shoulder smashed into Haku's ribs, the unexpected blow shoving the young Chunin aside. But he was still in the way, and no time left to use his staff. Moving with a precision he thought he'd lost a decade ago, the Sandaime Hokage brought his right arm up in a picture-perfect inside forearm block just as the sword reached him. Sparks flew from the metal bracer as the poisoned blade was diverted to the side. The metal was heavily scored, but the attack had missed. "So noble, even to the end," a voice said behind him, dripping with scorn. He spun to see Orochimaru standing behind him on two perfectly fine legs, swinging the sword he had just caught at the Hokage's head. Fooled by a simple henge, he thought in disgust. With Enma in his left hand, there was no chance of bringing the staff around in time. He got his forearm up in time to block, but this time the blade bit into the damaged metal. He barely felt the cut as the blade pierced the sleeve of his uniform, but the burning agony as the poison seeped into his veins made him gasp. "You're dead already, old man," Orochimaru sneered. "No," Haku snapped. The Chunin grabbed the Hokage's upper arm and the burning was replaced by numbness as the old man's entire arm was frozen solid. The ice encasing the bracer climbed up the sword and in a flash had enveloped Orochimaru's right hand. His left hand barely let go of the blade before it too was captured. Out of the corner of his eye, Sarutobi could see the boy's face twisted into a rictus of hate. The ice around his arm advanced no further, but it moved steadily up Orochimaru's as he tried to pull free. Still, the Hokage's entire limb had been frozen solid, and the cold began to seep into the rest of his body, draining his flagging energy and making him very, very tired. "Haku?" he said. The fury melted away from the boy's face. "I am sorry, Hokage-sama, but that is the only way I can think of to stop the poison," Haku said in a soft voice. "But the ice on him will advance until it stops his heart." Orochimaru tugged harder, pulling both of them forward. Despite his frantic efforts, they were still joined together as the ice passed his elbow and moved toward his shoulder. "Let me go, you freak," he hissed. "For attacking my Hokage, you will die," Haku said, his soft voice as implacable as any Sarutobi could remember. With a snarl of frustration, Orochimaru raised his free hand and smashed it down on his frozen forearm. It shattered into grisly chunks, as did the sword. The snake summoner leapt back as the barrier suddenly flickered and died. 4 shadowy figures leapt in from the corners as the anbu just started moving. Haku moved to guard the Hokage, who was sinking to his knees and beginning to shake, but all 4 of them converged on Orochimaru. Sarutobi lost sight of them as the anbu moved in. He thought he saw them leap away with anbu in pursuit, but his vision was getting cloudy. He blinked as one of the masked shinobi angrily demanded that Haku explain himself. The arm was poisoned, the Hokage said in a shaky voice. Orochimaru wouldn't use any venom that has an antidote. He coughed and shivered again. "It will have to come off." The day seemed to be getting darker, but Sarutobi knew better. He hoped things were going better elsewhere in the village he loved. If the situation wasn't so deadly, Naruto would have laughed out loud. Sabaku no Gaara, demon container and terror of the sands, was now wide awake. To go with his wide eyes. His short red hair was now standing completely once than Hinata's had been, that time they'd sparred. Of course, Naruto had a clear view of this since one arm was wrapped tightly around Gaara's shoulders and the other was holding a kunai up to his right eyeball. Despairing wails from the demon below them nearly shattered his eardrums, but they also told him that waking up Gaara had been a smart move. The mass of sand below them seemed to be softening, losing cohesion, even as it reared up to crush the green-clad genin. His legs were already enveloped. "Don't even think about it," Naruto snapped. "Unless you think you can kill me before I push this through your eye. No sand there to stop it." It was a calculated risk. He wasn't sure that even the threat of instant death would deter the crazy jinchuriki. But the sand stopped rising, for the moment at least. He could also feel the mass below them trembling as the demon let out a mournful sigh at a deafening volume. What he wasn't prepared for was Gaara's dark-ringed eyes to focus past the kunai and lock onto his own. "Why haven't you killed me?" he asked in an eerily calm voice. "My existence has no meaning." The utterly emotionless way the question was asked made Naruto's stomach turn over. He remembered Hinata wondering what it would be like if he'd been raised with no one who cared about him, no one precious to him. If he'd been raised as a weapon, like it seems Gaara was. For an instant, Naruto was struck by a thunderbolt of déjà vu. This was not right. He remembered sitting by Hinata's bed at the hospital, hearing her describe her family. This was wrong and he had to fix it. Somehow, the sand was still losing cohesion, but Naruto was more concerned about Gaara. The empty teal eyes were looking past the kunai, focusing on him now. If he decided that Naruto lacked the will to kill him. Naruto blinked as he received the memories of another clone. This one had been helping Hinata with the fan user, Tamari, the one Sensei's dossier identified as Gaara's sister. His clone had been caught on the edge of a wind blast, but before he dispersed, he'd gotten a good look at the kunoichi. She was trying desperately to get past Hinata and into the clearing, even though she moved like she'd taken more than a couple of Jukin hits. Even as he saw Gaara's eyes take on a calculating look, Naruto scowled and snapped, "Idiot." Gaara blinked. "You say your existence has no meaning?" Naruto snarled. Then why the hell are your brother and sister trying so hard to save you? The look on Gaara's face was so bewildered that Naruto felt a little sick inside, but he didn't let that show on his face. Your sister can't even move one of her arms and she's still trying to get past my teammate. He grimaced. She's crying and screaming your name, you idiot. And your brother is facing 2-to-1 odds as well. Maybe you don't think your existence has any meaning, but they sure as hell do. And they're going to get killed if we keep this up much longer. The Suna genin, whose hair was finally returning to normal, leaned forward, totally ignoring Naruto's kunai. She's crying? He asked, his hollow voice a little less remote than before. She never cries. Well, she is now, Naruto snapped, pulling back the kunai before the oblivious demon container hurt himself. She obviously cares about what happens to you, even if you don't. Are you going to get her killed? Gaara's eyes focused again on Naruto's with an intensity he found really creepy. You won't hesitate to kill me, will you? Not if it will keep my friends safe, Naruto replied, his voice cracking despite his best efforts. Then why did you stop just now? Because, Naruto's voice trailed off, because you're like me. Or would I be like if I didn't have my friends? One of them pointed that out to me. I had a chance to give you a choice, so I did. Gaara stared at him for a long moment, and Naruto tightened his grip around the kunai. Then the Suna genin slowly nodded. The sand moved away from them both, releasing Naruto's legs, and slowly lowered them to the ground. When they reached the ground, most of the sand dispersed while the rest moved to reform the calabash on Gaara's back. Naruto warily released his hold on Gaara and pocketed his kunai. The other battles around the clearing had slowly ground to a halt while this was happening, so it was mostly silent when Gaara raised his voice. Our mission is ended. Author's notes. Dang, that was hard to write. Interweaving multiple action sequences and not having them suck. And hopefully having all of them contribute to building the tension, was surprisingly challenging. Before anyone else asks. Yes, the Hyuga clan is a lot nastier than in canon. The reason is directly related to the O divergence point, which as I have said, occurred well before the story begins. Even before Naruto was born. In fact, his behavior is a major clue that one reader has already used to figure out the plot. Complaining that you think Hiyashi is out of character is like complaining that the story events haven't exactly mirrored canon. The exact sequence of events will eventually be revealed, but feel free to speculate on the Viridian Dreams forums. Temari isn't a weakling, but she had an ideal matchup in the preliminaries, a real stroke of luck. She certainly didn't dominate her match against Shikamaru, and now she's facing someone who doesn't like to fight at long range with easily deflected weapons, and in terrain that limits the effectiveness of her techniques. And no, I don't think she has her summon yet, or she'd have used it against Sasuke in canon. Hinata has also been through her own crucible of swords, but this was only a preliminary test of her true mettle. Why did Shino club Kankuro instead of slicing him up? 3 reasons. Information in his head could be valuable, and with his Kikai tearing up Karasu, Kankuro is much less of a threat. Finally, he is a blood relative of Gaara, and holding him captive might give them some small leverage against the Tanuki version of Godzilla. Probably not as much leverage as Shino might hope, but he doesn't know quite how messed up Gaara's childhood really was. No, this isn't Haku's first appearance in the story. Remember the Chunin that led Naruto to the bathroom? The one Sakura looked startled at? Yeah, that one? Yes, Orochimaru's plan has kind of fallen to pieces, but in canon I found it to be rather overly complicated and not failure insulated. Someone needs to remind that megalomaniac that no plan survives contact with the enemy. And yes, I enjoyed chucking a couple of monkey wrenches into things. Regarding Shukaku's paw, light a firecracker and let it go off on the open palm of your hand. You will get a bruise and a minor burn. Let it go off inside a clenched fist and you will likely need help picking up your fingers. The chakra-enriched sand also mostly contained that pulse, so it didn't travel very far. Not that Naruto could see too much at the time. Temari, there were hints of her concern for her brother in canon, but they were battling with fear of him and overconfidence in his abilities. As she said, seeing him get manhandled awoke her to the fact that he isn't invulnerable, which led to her reaction when it looked like Naruto was about to kill her brother. A minor rant. Why do people ask me questions in unsigned reviews with no valid email address? Do they not really want an answer? One thank you to my father, from whom I borrowed one of the Sandame's pithier lines. I'm sure you'll recognize it when he sees it. He got me started on reading Heinlein at a very impressionable age, so most of what you read here is indirectly his fault anyway. Happy birthday, old man.